It's good. We don't ask questions for those in the first row. Are we live downrange? Okay, well, good. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome. My name's Ken LaPlante. I'm the acting director here at the William J. Perry Center. And welcome to our Hemispheric Forum. Today we're going to have a presentation. We're going to talk about the electoral cycle that is ongoing in Latin America. I want to thank you for your very valuable time for coming here and join us. And I also like to let you know that as has become our custom, we are live streaming in English and Spanish to various, we're just live streaming to whoever wants to come in, focused on our alumni associations, our partner institutions in the Americas, but also we have alumni throughout the world. To the folks that are joining us via technology of the 21st century, good afternoon. Para los que nos acompañan esta tarde por medio de tecnología, muy buenas tardes. In the last 6 months, but for a period of almost 18 months starting last summer there, and we count forward 18 months, there will have been a total of about 10 national elections in the Americas. A couple of them are ongoing right now. One in Honduras has just ended and is being discussed by both parties, both candidates. So, and the outcomes, well, in some cases are, I'll use the term interesting, to keep it apolitical. But the resulting collective will have, or could have, an impact across a broad spectrum, nationally, sub-regionally, and regionally. And that is what our panelists are going to discuss today. Now, the panel, our moderator will be our own distinguished Dr. Luis Betancourt, my right, your left, our Dean of Academic Affairs. And Dr. Betancourt will introduce the panelists. So my time's up. This Kentucky boy is going to sit down and listen and learn. I look forward to your comments from participants here and from the participants in the region. Estoy en espera de los comentarios y observaciones de los participantes virtuales que pueden mandarme por medio de cualquier email que llegue aquí al centro. And without further ado, with Dr. Luis Betancourt. Luis.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, particularly for the distinguished. I'm very impressed with that. Thank you, sir. I feel myself distinguished today. Very glad to have you here this afternoon. As you may know, our Perry Center, our Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, has as one of our mission is really to produce dialogue, to produce ideas on the most important topics that may affect defense and security throughout the region. And of course, politics is one of the issues that affect profoundly this. We feel this here, in this part of the world, and we will feel this in different parts of the world. And this is what today is about. I'd like to start in a slightly different way, this panel today, with a personal testimony. I am originally from Brazil, Brasileiro Americano. In 1984, and 1984 is a very emblematic date for me, as could be for anyone, including George Orwell. And it was particularly important because of the title of that book. In 1984, I was working in the Brazilian military cabinet in an institution called the National Security Council. And I was very concerned with my job, because this was the last year of a military government, a military regime, authoritarian regime in Brazil, after 21 years in power. And so the book 1984 was very emblematic for me. There was a relationship with authoritarianism in that book, and what was looming ahead of us when democracy would finally come back to Brazil. And this was happening in many other countries around the region, as you may remember. The last one in that wave was Chile in 1990, coming out of authoritarian regime into democracies. And they had different histories with this authoritarianism. But the main fact is that those periods affected profoundly the politics. And this gives tremendous relevance for the topic we are going to visit today. We are concerned, of course, with elections, the election cycle, but when we think of Latin America, it's impossible not to think about what was before and what's the relevance of today as democracies that we have. And what you will hear today is really about democracy, but the good news is that we have democracy, and the bad news is that we have democracies, and what kind of democracies we may have there. So what we are trying to bring to you is some nuance to this most recent cycle of elections that we are witnessing throughout the region. And for this, we have really three masters, subject matter experts, masters in Latin America. If we had 20 here, we would have 20 different perspectives. We have three, and they are very well known and respected. I will not read the resumes because we would spend the rest of our time today reading the resumes. But we will start with Joanna Mendelssohn, as a good friend. She's a senior associate of the Program on Crisis, Conflict, and Cooperation of the Americas programs at the CSIS. If I could define Joanna in one single phrase, I would say that whatever is hot in Latin America, Joanna is involved with. And she has such an ability to anticipate issues that will be hot in the near future. And be sure that what you can get from her is always a qualified and very well informed opinion on whatever she deals with. We will have Roberto Isurieta, who is the director of Latin American projects for the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University. And Roberto, who has been kind enough to come to help us in replacing Riordan Royat, who was originally committed to the panel but could not come here. And Roberto, so graceful, agreed in participating in this panel, has one characteristic which I believe is quite useful for us. He helps making gods around the hemisphere. He's a political advisor for political, in addition to his professorial matter, he also helps in marketing. Is this the right word, Roberto? Some politicians. So he knows the game from the inner side. And we will conclude the presentations with Harold Tricunas, the Charles Robinson Chair at Senior Fellow and Director of the Latin American Initiative in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Harold, what a big name, but big title to have. Huh? It's a big... And Harold is also very well known expert in understanding, helping us understanding the politics in the region, but also with in what matters to security and defense, because of his experience and expertise in that you can just check it in his resume. So we will go right away. We'll start with Joanna to bring us the perspective. Please annotate your questions, and then we'll go in line. I'm not sure whether we'll have a break at some point, but please annotate your questions, and we'll be open to questions there. And for people also and in our town range around the region, do not hesitate also in sending your emails and asking questions, because it will be welcome here. So we start, Joanna, and I'll be controlling the 15 minutes, Joanna, as kind as I can.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and it's always great to be back at the Perry Center. I've watched this institution grow from a little operation when it was first thought of in the early 90s to its extraordinary scope of interest in students. So I want to thank Acting Director Ken LaPlante and Dean Luis Bittencourt, who are always kind and generous, and to my other colleagues like Selena Reolullo, who called me, and Michael Mann, who made this possible by even finding me a parking space and being very gracious to thank you for my presence here and also, of course, to be joined by two excellent panelists. I was asked to be sort of the grandmother and to go back over the history of where U.S. policy arrived at this moment, because we certainly are at a time when election support is still quite important in terms of foreign assistance, but we are facing challenges that are really a phenomena of a much more complex political environment, not only in the hemisphere, but globally. And so when I was sent a question of what was the impact of U.S. national security policymakers on the continuity of the electoral cycle, I thought the question really raised to me whether continuity is really an indicator of better institutional support or civic participation. Because we can have a lot of continuity, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of the results are any better. And I think just reading the headlines in the last week of the challenges to the elections in Honduras, the tensions in the electoral observer missions, the dissent reports, once again call up the question of the dynamics of the need for strong institutions, the role of citizens in these political processes, and how the technical advice that is provided to governments and to citizen groups is actually used. So I start this conversation with a note of caution, because one of the things that the United States has done very well, certainly since the end of the Cold War, certainly our training and technical assistance programs that support the electoral process, the elections per se, is a very important component of our foreign policy, but they do not, and I underscore, they do not resolve the deep structural problems that afflict many of the countries in the region. Elections can't solve transnational crimes. They can't solve the resourcing questions. And they can't fix income inequality. So when we talk about the process of elections, which are, of course, considered an important part of the broader cycle of democratic governance, we have to understand the limitations of elections as well. And I've always argued this, in meetings ad nauseum, that elections are a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. They are important to create institutions that are fair and transparent and that observe international human rights. But the achievements sought through electoral changes will occur only when we realize that Latin America suffers not from an election deficit. We've had 10 in a cycle, but really an institutional deficit. And what I mean by this is creating elected bodies to govern in many ways does not convey it with responsible government, and it doesn't even convey sometimes a genuine social contract with citizens, which is what the essence of democratic governance is about. So that's my caveat. But what is also important, and saying this as an American citizen who has work to support election. My first job when I came to USAID, because nobody wanted the portfolio, was electoral assistance in Latin America. Everybody wanted the hot stuff. So here's a contradiction, Luis. Everybody wanted rule of law because that was the hot topic, and I was given elections. But in fact, elections in the Western Hemisphere at the time, in the early 90s, was becoming a very important part of other processes which my colleagues have been involved in, of democratic openings, of improved civil-military relations. So it was a learning process for myself and for the U.S. government as to how to work with international institutions, how to work with other governments bilaterally, how to work with NGOs, and how to help NGOs become better participants in the electoral process. But the United States also carries some heavy baggage in this partnership, and I think it's coming back again to circle the encampment. A few weeks ago, Congressman Eliot Engel, who has always had a very deep interest in the Western Hemisphere and is now the ranking minority on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, said, "The burden is on us to actually persuade our Central American friends that we do not have a finger on the electoral scale and that we will work with whoever is elected. The historical context calls for nothing less." And I think this is a very important factor. There is still a perception that the United States electoral assistance, technical assistance, and now spreading to multilateral institutions has in some ways a partisan bent, that it picks winners and losers. And in fact, that's the most difficult position to emerge from, because the role And historically, the role of electoral assistance since the end of the Cold War has not been to pick winners and losers, but to rather to make sure that the process conforms with international standards. And, you know, it's ironic that we talk about this because the Inter-American Democratic Charter was signed in Honduras in 2001. And yet here we are, we're talking about an election which is very troublesome in many ways because of the procedural issues, of the kinds of challenges that are taking, and yet there is still the perception that the U.S. is behind something in many of the periodicals that you read in and many of the online media. So I make that point not in any way to condemn U.S. policy, but to put it out there as a warning. But I am a person who takes the long view, having watched this kind of assistance go on for a while. And in many ways, we have done some really successful institution building in terms of election. We have the standard, as the world has the standard, of free and fair elections. What does that mean? The U.S. election policy that USAID supports, and of course is part of an overall State Department approach to democracy, is really one that means that you have to guarantee certain civil liberties such as speech, association, and assembly. That's what the standards are for free and fair. We see in U.S. government policy, elections are a primary tool to foster political openings. That was what we saw all through the 90s as transitions occurred. And we also encourage, elections serve to encourage debate. You get on the table different issues about the quality of life, about economics, about, what should happen in your country. These are things that the United States, per se, could not influence. These are dialogues among citizens, and that's probably the most important aspect of political competition that we're trying to create. And just a little factoid that in 2012, which is the last year we have full records for, we expanded as a government political participation by training 9,800 domestic election workers worldwide, and that we provided voter and civic education reaching more than 6.5 million people. That's a pretty big reach, as far as I'm concerned, and that's where assistance still goes. Now, it's not going so much to Latin America anymore as other parts of the world, but it is an ongoing process. So, what do we have going in terms of trends in electoral democracies? We know that in the early 90s, as I mentioned, we really had a blossoming of the whole electoral system process. We had institutions that were created. The National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up, the NED, to help support the emerging democracies of Eastern Europe, and then the openings in Latin America. These were created to support political party institutes, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republic Institute. These were really the heydays in the 90s of true democratic openings when assistance was done to create what I just described, this technical support and participation of citizens. But then something happened. After 2005, and there are other trends, and I'm sure my colleagues will mention it, if you go to the Freedom House records, there was a decline in the quality of democratic processes. And I think what accounts for this are two situations which you all are familiar with. After 9/11, we refocused our attention as a nation away from democratization to a war on terror. There was a legitimate reason for it. Our country had been attacked. But many speculate that the support for democracy went away as authoritarian governments that did exist were actually beneficial to U.S. policy goals in countering terrorism. And of course, there are exceptions, because one of the main objectives in Iraq was to create a more open and democratic society after the fall of Saddam Hussein. And the United States government invested billions of dollars in citizen support for electoral processes in conjunction with the United Nations. The second factor, which some equate with the turning of the electoral systems more to a less democratic situation, is the global economic crisis, which we are still suffering from in many parts of the world. There was a damage to democracy's appeal, and these are just general trends, and some consider that what happened in many countries in the developing world was just as the middle class was beginning to rise, just as poverty alleviation was beginning to show tangible effects, we also began to see this prosperity crumbling. And I think Leonel Fernandez, the former president of the Dominican Republic, said in 2008, a year after the crash happened, that expectations over the prospects of democracy in the region have given way to disillusion that democracy has failed to boost economic prosperity. And I think this is also ingrained in a third factor, that there was a revolt of the middle classes in Latin America against authoritarian tendencies. And one of the most vivid examples, and I'm sure we have people here who can talk much better to this than I, is when in Bolivia, for example, there was a revolt by middle class against the government of Evo Morales. There was an attempt to secede. And more recently, we've seen this kind of more complex situations, and I'm boiling these down to very simple factors. In Egypt, where you have the revolt against Morsi, not the first overthrow of Mubarak, but I consider that a middle-class military coup in some ways in Egypt, and you have what's going on right now as we turn on the television and watch CNN International in Thailand, where you have the government of Shinawatра's sister being torn down by people on the street who are totally disenchanted by the economic situation there, as well as what is considered a thuggery in the government. So I mentioned all these transitions. The 90s is the heyday of democratic elections. There were some very interesting shifts. Many countries that had compulsory voting, something that is a vestige of authoritarian governments, went to voting as not a compulsory activity where you couldn't, leave the country or get your passport stamped. There was an important issue which I think people often overlook, but sitting in an institution that does civil-military relations, was the inclusion of the military in the electoral process. For many years, many militaries in Latin America, and there are good charts which show which ones, in Freedom House's list and also in IFAS, could not vote. Now, it's terrible to exclude a portion of the population that are citizens. If you really believe in a citizen soldier has to vote. And that is changing too. My colleagues are going to talk about the number of elections that we now face from Brazil, Chile, Argentina, to El Salvador, Peru. Haiti is going to have another election coming up. Venezuela has local elections this month in December. But one of the things that has happened, which has been more important but also somewhat controversial, has been the maturation of the electoral observance processes. We have, under the OAS, I think one of the more successful programs of that multilateral organization. The OAS has made election observing into a very refined science. And I think some of it arises from the Democratic Charter, which my colleague Harold has here, in that it has done something important in codifying election observation, setting up evaluation and monitoring standards, and it's gone beyond what I would call the simple take your congressional delegation to see an election to early intervention in terms of not negative intervention, but as mediation, negotiation, technical support, and it doesn't always come out right, but it does serve an important point because until, I would say, around 2008, the OAS had a much stronger aura of neutrality, of not picking winners than just a bilateral donor's government aid. So just a quick overview where election observation actually helped prevent turmoil. 1994, the Dominican Republic elections were a very difficult time. There were tremendous irregularities, and actually it was the beginning of a democratic transition because of violence being averted at that time. And there was a creation of a democracy pact to a no re-election clause, which now is being overturned. I'm sure one of you will talk about that. But 1994 was an important example of international election observing, preserving a process that could move forward. 2000 in Peru, the OAS observer mission found serious irregularities in computing and technical support. Fujimori postponed the election. Toledo boycotted the election. But at the end of the day, it turned out that, Fujimori was out and there were new elections in 2001. These were all part of a process that included the observation of elections and the support to these processes by international bodies. May 2000, Venezuela's mega elections, the OAS identified tremendous technical problems and breakdown. It postponed regional elections. And Haiti in 2010 and then subsequently in 2011 with the runoff, the OAS in joint committee with CARICOM identified so many irregularities that the process had to be postponed and a final runoff took place in 2011. Now, as sophisticated as these missions have grown, they are not passive. And they raise many serious questions about activist roles of electoral observing missions, whether they're done by the U.S., by the UN, whether they're done in conjunction, and whether, in fact, beyond handling the technical issues of identification and logistics, they actually create what I call a fine line between involving oneself in politics and actually being overseeing processes. It gets very sticky, and some of the same suspicions that have been harbored against the United States now face international organizations like the OAS in performing what I think are important services to countries that have real need for institutional support in these processes. And certainly, if we talk about one sad situation, the credibility of the OAS, I think, in 2009 was very much harmed by the situation in Honduras and the way the elections went there. Rebuilding that confidence is really the issue we face. So I'm going to just quickly go through some other factors which have been important in determining the election and then be quiet because I want to hear from my other friends. And that is, in the last 20 years, we're bumping up with a certain kind of reality of problems in the region. We are faced with governments, which we've mentioned at the beginning, have gone to a much more authoritarian or a mano duro example of what they consider a democratic processes. We've had strange procedures, for example, in the way the elections happened when Maduro ran for election when he didn't have to in Venezuela after the death of Chavez since he was vice president. In Paraguay, you had the elections after Lugo resigned, and then there was an interim period of an election and then a regular one in April. Now in Chile, of course, you have, which is not a troublesome country, you have the election of Bachelet with a runoff. The challenge in Honduras, where you have issues between the Libre Party candidate Castro, who claims to have won, and the winner itself. So I guess at the end of the day, what we're facing up against with election is that as you get a growing middle class, despite the fact that there have been bumps in the road in getting to this, you are going to have greater attention by citizens to their political outcomes and their stakes, and it's going to make the problem a lot harder. When you have a middle class, when the global economic bubble bursts, you have to be able to figure out how elections can become mediating opportunities and not the means to create greater polarization in a society. So what do we do? Should the OAS play some kind of an interventionary role? The Inter-American Democratic Charter indeed gives the Secretary General the right to bring to the Permanent Council's attention questions that constitute, quote, unconstitutional alteration that ultimately impairs the democratic order of a member state. Should this happen? It's unclear because of the challenges within the OAS and because it's an institution that works by consensus. But I guess at the end of the day, the challenge in the hemisphere is that can other states become the moderating forces to political processes? And many people talk about, besides the United States and Canada, whether Mexico, whether Chile, whether Costa Rica or Brazil, countries that have now had long electoral histories, become those moderating forces. And I think that's where I see a new grouping of states emerging to take on this mantle of electoral reform in a way that doesn't bring with it what I described earlier as some baggage of partisanship, but also can work with friends and allies to ensure that people get their right at the ballot box. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joanna. I think Joanna leaves some important questions in our minds. And one question that I would leave just for your consideration in the debate session, Joanna, would be, since there is this dissolution with the democracy as a process, since from here we have perhaps different perspectives, come to my mind a movie that I saw recently in which they portray Sarah Palin in Camping. Quite a good movie in terms of the artist. I think some of you may have seen that. But I remember one specific moment in that movie in which defeat McCain, Sarah wants to also to go there and recognize that. And the advisors doing Roberto's job were saying that, no, you should not do this. This is a test for the candidate only, and not for you as a deputy. And then she insisted that she must do that. She said that, no, you're not going to do that because this is our tradition. So there's a combination of principle, tradition, practice that help democracy to get healthy. And this is perhaps a point that we don't have yet in many of the young democracies in Latin America. And my questions to Joanna for the questions and answer period was that, could we have any hope that this will mature, not maduro, mature at some point in the future? This is a question to stay here. And I would ask Roberto. Roberto was thinking that probably you would not get a job at this point. You would not be so busy as you said, that you were complaining about so frequent trips that you have. But should we did not have democracies and electoral cycles going on in the region? So it's good news for you. And also our interpreters asked that in a more technical way that if we could slow down a little bit the speech so that they can do better their job. Thank you. Roberto, you have it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Johanna is right when she said we haven't had a deficit of elections in the regions. And I am not a professor of political science. I'm a practitioner. We have a school in George Washington that teach practical politics, basically elections, crisis, lobby, public relations, all that. And my duty is to be involved in basically most countries I can in Latin America. So my real expertise is how to fly cheap in American Airlines because I flew more than 4 million miles. And so that's my real expertise. But in all those travels, yes, I meet with politicians. I work in elections. I have the privilege to work so far for 4 presidents. But if anyone come to me and tell me, which has happened, that I have a candidate that is very charismatic, he is very well prepared to run for president in Ecuador, I will tell him that good luck and I'm busy because I don't think nothing is going to happen. Because to me the problem is not how many elections we have, and Johanna say very well, election has to be free and fair. And they're relatively not free, but more importantly, they are not fair. And then it comes the question that you're not going to find any election anywhere, even in the United States, that is fair. I don't think very few things in life are fair. But the question is when the law is set, is developed to produce a result. So when the law of the elections are set to produce a specific result, that's totally different. When basically you are running against a regulation and law that are created to produce total unfairness. And that's when I come to my job, I would tell you, I'm sorry, I cannot do that because the fight that you have to do is a different fight. It's not the election. It's about the process, it's about the laws, it's about the structure, about everything that's going on in your country. And that's not my job. Again, I'm not a professor of political science, but if you read the Greeks, the Romans, the French, the British, the American founders about democracy, they would tell you many, many, many things. But there's only one thing that all agree, and there's only one condition that they will all be talking about. The need to stop absolute power. The concept of democracy came from the Greeks, Romans, French, British, Americans, when we try to stop absolute power. That's democracy. And the only thing that they agree is that a leader cannot have all the powers. So that's where it comes, the division of powers. And you were saying, check and balances. So if somebody comes to me and say, well, I am in a democratic regime because I have elections, I would tell you, well, Pinochet did, Trujillo did, Stroessner did, the PRI during the 70 years of domination did. Cuba has elections. I mean, that's not the point to me. That does not define democracy. So, in my opinion, unfortunately, in the region, we have many countries that, in my opinion, they are not democratic because they do not comply with the only important condition of democracy, division of power. And if you are interested, I was a few months ago with this book that came in English, The 21st Century Dictatorship from Osvaldo Hurtado, who is an academic and a former president too, and I respect him very much. So, and again, I was taking finally 4 days vacation when I read the results in Honduras, and the Conservative Party won. I was surprised because Honduras, it is not in a very, the situation in Honduras is very complicated. The security, is very complicated. The murders, now it has, Belize and Honduras has at the top in the region, per capita murders. The popularity of the government is low. So you wonder, how did he win? But my first reaction was, I can assure you that the votes were counted well. Because for all the work that the United States, the US, Canada, many other countries, and also because of the transparency through communications, not, internet and all that, I don't see we're going to see much trouble there. Every election, even if I don't know, when they were saying in Venezuela, in the last election, if Maduro doesn't win, he's going to win anyway. I don't believe that. I think the votes are going to be counted well, and we have to continue. Everybody who believes in democracy, they have to continue the effort that you were describing to keep that as it is. But again, in my opinion, that's not where the problems are. It does not call my professional attention because I think in general that is going to continue to be like that. We have elections in Uruguay and Chile. Don't worry about that. Talking about the principles that we were talking here, the principles of democracy, the tradition of democracy, the value of democracy, Chile and Uruguay will respect that. Uruguay, for example, they have elections next year. They have the tradition that in Congress, every year the president of Congress is from one of the party, no matter how many votes you got. So now, the president of Congress of Uruguay is from the Colorado party, who represents basically 10-15% of the vote. And he's the president of the country, of the Congress. And the president before most likely was from the Partido Blanco, and before Frente Amplio in the next. So why? Because you have a tradition of where they respect the principles and the values of democracy. And the other important condition to have a democratic system is to respect minorities. I'm not an expert in the Middle East, but when you were just as a regular citizen, you were watching what was going on in Egypt, it is not enough to win an elections. If you are not allow the people who lost to have their space, their representation, you are going to end up having problems. Whether the problems are going to be the same that you have in Egypt or not. But let's talk about just one example about the representation of power to questions our thinking. In the last election for the Senate in Dominican Republic, which is, everything is doing well there. The governmental party won basically by, I think, 2 or 3 points. How many seats do they got in the Senate? They only won with the other party by 2 or 3 points. How many seats do they got? All of them. So when you confront a situation like that, you say, I have a problem with that. I'm sorry, but I have a problem. I don't have a political opinion. But if the party won only by 2%, but they have all the seats in the Senate, we have a problem. Why? Because democracy requires the representation of minorities. Simple as that. And it comes back to the basic principle that is what democracy is about. The division of power. democracy is built to not allow a single person to have all the power, the absolute power. Simple as that. And that's the challenge that we had. That situation had not exploded. Why? Because at the same time, where we were facing those kind of, in my opinion, dictatorships, they were going through very good economic cycles. The price of oil, the price of gas, the price of commodities. And let's face it, even in our country here, if people are doing well economically, the people will look on the other side. Simple as that. And Venezuela, Ecuador, Nicaragua, they are not any different than that. My concern, because this is my way of thinking, my concern is that is changing. And it's changing this year and it's changing next year. So things, the way they were, will not be like that any much longer. And Venezuela comes to my mind at the first point of attention. So yes, now I'm interested and I'm paying attention to Venezuela. Why? Because despite all the resources that they have, they are running out of money. And what the situation that you're confronted, and I'm not an economist, well, actually I am, but I never really practiced. Anyway, the situation that you have with the exchange rate is just the alert that something very big is going on. And those systems cannot survive if people are not doing economically well. So what is going to happen in Venezuela, I do not know. Even in any scenario, if you say, okay, in the midterm elections, the government is going to lose big. What is going to happen? I do not know. Even if they call for a referendum and Maduro loses, what is going to happen? I do not know. Because to be the leader and to be the president, if I am Capriles, I am in the office of the president of Venezuela next year, democratically, I mean, with all the whatever they call democracy, what is he going to do? He's going to open the currency market, which will create an enormous inflation, which will create an enormous instability, and very likely will be out of office in question of months. So I am concerned about what is going on. Very concerned. Because in my opinion, what we have been seeing, it is not a democratic process. But it did not cause major conflicts because those countries had a lot of resources. So anytime anybody asks me what is going to happen in Ecuador or in Venezuela, I say we need to look at the numbers to see how much money they have. If Korea can't have the resources that he needs through the exploitation of the Yasuni, the park, for the oil, you will have stability. But if not, the system does not work if they do not have those extraordinary resources to maintain what they call it is democracy. Argentina. The situation in Argentina is very difficult now economically. Brazil and even Mexico. They just came with the new number of the growth, the GDP. Mexico is going to be, I think, between 0.8 to 1.2 when they have like 3 or 4 the last 2 years. I'm not worried about Mexico because Mexico has other variables, and I think despite all other kind of problems, I'm not worried. But Brazil, like 10 months before, nobody was questioning that the president will be reelected because she has a popularity of 70%. And then a group of students start to protest in Sao Paulo because they were going to raise the price of the bus ride. But it goes bigger, and her numbers came down substantially. To me, why? Because people were feeling the economic pressure for the first time in 10 years. And they say, you know what? Yeah, I cannot take it anymore because I feel that pressure. And these guys, are corrupt, are taking, they are being arrogant or whatever. So I'm going to go to the streets. And her numbers came down from 70 to 35 in a question of 3 months. Those systems work as long as they have money. If they don't have money, a lot of things are going to happen. What is going to happen, I do not know. But I will be personally and professionally very attentive to monitor what is going on. Because a lot of changes, I'm afraid, we are going to see in all those countries. And I'm not worried about Argentina as much. I'm not worried about Brazil as much. Definitely I'm not worried about Uruguay or Chile. I'm not worried about Colombia. I'm not worried about El Salvador. I am worried about Venezuela. And if something happens in Venezuela, things are going to happen in Cuba, things are going to happen in Nicaragua, things might happen in Ecuador, and who knows, Brazil and Argentina. That's my way of thinking. I hope it helps you. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. I think, Roberto, we could call it Blake perspective, not so optimist perspective of the region. When you contrast that is the end of the economic bonanza in Latin America that I think was lasting perhaps 10 years, and now the future does not seem so rosy. But this would make us so negative towards the ability of democracy or of the processes of democracy, together with what Joanna said, should make us very concerned with the near future in the region. And what we see today as a region relatively peaceful, despite of the social movements here and there, but it's relatively peaceful in this sense. Maybe this can change in the future if what you say is true. Harold, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and I thank you to the Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies for your invitation. There's a lot of longtime friends in the audience, so it's wonderful to see folks again. And so I'm very happy to be here talking on this subject, which has always been near to my heart. I got my start as a graduate student working on issues related to democratization. And I also have to thank my colleagues for making my job easier, because about half my talk I can just scratch out now. Because I agree, I think excellent points were raised, and I agree by and large with everything they brought up. I do want to emphasize something that I think I was thinking back to other talks I've given on this issue. And 15 years ago, we loved to say that every country in the hemisphere is a democracy, except for one, and how there was an inter-American consensus on democracy. We signed an Inter-American Democratic Charter in 1999, and then look around today and realize that something like that would never have been signed today. There's simply that consensus we had on not just democracy, but the content of democracy, what democracy meant, which was much stronger 15 years ago than it is today. And that is a real loss, I think, for the hemisphere, that sort of golden moment. Maybe it was too much to expect that it would last, probably was, but it is something to keep in mind, that consensus on the defense of democracy in the Americas has broken down, not because people don't want democracy, but there's simply no agreement on the content or definition of democracy. And I think Roberto and Joanna have both pointed at the issues associated with that. And I think that that's important if we think about the inter-American, sort of the tacit bargain of the inter-American system, is that being a democracy is really an underpinning for your sovereignty, for your, your way you interact with the rest of the system, for your ability to make your own decisions is based on the fact that you're making those decisions democratically, and that not being a democracy actually means something. I mean, it means something for the Cubans to be defined as non-democratic, because it sort of underpins a lot of policies that are directed at non-democratic governments in the hemisphere. So this debate is going to continue, and it will become progressively probably more rancorous as the deficiencies of some of the less democratic countries in the Inter-American system, in the Americas, become more and more evident, especially, as Lorenzo pointed out, now that the money is gone. There's a number of you have pointed out now that the money is been reduced, these systems will have a great deal of difficulty maintaining legitimacy. So I would just put that as a general point that this is going to become a very difficult, I think, discussion going forward as these systems exist, these countries exhibit more and more problems. I was asked to talk about the political landscape in Latin America after this electoral cycle, what the implications are for public policy in the region, and more specifically for defense and security. So let me just take those in order. And I have to say that I really want to thank my colleagues for pointing out that we're really talking about two different sets of countries. Countries where democracy is consolidated, the rules of the game are agreed to, and while policy might change because a different party takes power, we're really not countries we're worried about. As you know, Chile and Uruguay, we're not worried about countries like that. Even countries like El Salvador, which have sort of quite intense political debates going on, we're not really too worried that the rules of the game are seriously in question. The countries we do worry about are the ones where clearly the rules of the game have changed, are up for question, they're clearly unfair. These are the countries where we really have our area of concern, where that political outcomes really do mean something. Countries like Honduras, like Venezuela, like even Argentina, which had a very consolidated democracy for a long time, but steadily has had more and more political pressure on those institutions during the most recent elections. And we, of course, see that if we just look at the contrast between the recent elections in Chile, the elections in Argentina, and the elections in Honduras in terms of the relative difficulty and the kinds of questions that each of these elections raised about the futures of these countries. In Chile, it might mean 10% to the left, 10% to the right, checks and balances, nothing's going to change too much. In Argentina, each election is sort of a test of are institutions still strong? Are they still consolidated? Okay, we made it through another election. We still have some very important economic problems to solve. And then Honduras, where we're really debating, the Hondurans are debating the legitimacy of the elections as just a clear contrast of these. And we have some of these elections coming up. If we contrast elections where we don't worry about the rules of the game too much, places like Brazil versus countries like Venezuela, we do worry about the rules of the game. I'll set aside more discussion of politics because I think it's already been covered by some of my colleagues, although I'd be happy to come back to this in the Q&A. But given that distinction between consolidated and non-consolidated democracies or deconsolidated democracies in a number of cases, what is the effect of elections on sort of the policy landscape? And, I mean, there's two ways of thinking about this. One is, well, elections mean the possibility of different political actors coming to power that might have different policies. So that's true. We can talk about that. But I'm actually not going to focus on that. I really literally want to focus on the effect of elections on public policy making in countries in the hemisphere at this time. And just want to contrast the effects in three different countries, Colombia, Brazil, and Venezuela. If we look at Colombia today, we have a very interesting effect of a president whose popularity, he's in Washington this week, his popularity has dropped recently. He's in the middle of peace negotiations with the FARC. He has staked, in some ways, his political future on the outcome of those negotiations, and he's headed into an electoral cycle. So his future, in a certain sense, depends on the outcome of peace negotiations with his adversaries. That is a really interesting political puzzle that he is in because the election set a hard deadline for achieving something that is electorally acceptable for him going into a re-election cycle. And right now his numbers are in the 30s at best, I think. And so this is a question. How much does he give during the negotiations to try to get to a level of a deal that is electorally satisfactory or useful for him versus drawing the line and decide, well, I can't go that far even if I decide I might lose the election because of this. That's a very difficult position for a politician to be in. And the other question, if we think about it from this is a case where in a sense, the FARC get to vote as well. right? How much do they want to give to have somebody like Santos as their counterpart in the negotiations versus maybe, we should let him fail because whoever comes afterwards, that might be a better situation for us. So they're going to be making the calculation. So this is the case where the fact that you're in an electoral cycle is affecting very important public policy decisions in Colombia. And we still obviously don't know how a lot of variability in how those decisions can be drawn. And part of this also depends on Santos' popularity based on other issue areas. His popularity might go up for other reasons. Colombia's economic performance might improve, and this might get him a little bit out of this bind he has over the peace process. So this is a complex situation. Another case where elections are having an impact on public policy decision making is Brazil. Clearly, Brazil needs to have some sort of economic adjustment going forward in terms of the overvaluation of the currency, in terms of dealing with consumer debt burdens, which have really gotten extraordinarily high in Brazil from a historical perspective and a comparative perspective. In terms of, also dealing with inflation, dealing with maintaining investment and employment. So you don't want to have too much. And so it's very clear that the Brazilian government is trying to delay the difficult decisions until the other side of elections that are, still 11 months away. That's a long time to delay some of these decisions. And in fact, as we know, delayed adjustments typically become more difficult adjustments. So in a sense, you have to trade off your political calculations about how much you adjust now versus how much it might impact your numbers. And President Rousseff has been in the high 30s at best recently. So she also is going through this political calculation. How much do I do now what needs to be done to deal with these difficult problems versus what does it mean for my possibility to do other things in the future? Again, being an electoral cycle is affecting the decision-making process. And I think, interestingly, in the case of Venezuela, I think it's only possible to interpret some of the recent economic decisions the government has taken in a sense of really running out of the resources it took to maintain the system. The Bolivarian Revolution ran on consumption. Let's be very clear. There was a huge bonanza from oil revenues over the last 10 years. That is come to an end. And the way elections were won in the past in Venezuela, besides a lot of marginally democratic or non-democratic maneuvers by the government, was spending, and that's not available anymore. And so the decision to increasingly impose authoritarian economic measures, nationalize industries, decree price reductions, and all the other things we've heard about today, I think are clearly being forced by the electoral cycle, because the government understands that even though the elections on Sunday are municipal elections, they're national. And they're the first elections since Maduro came to power in very close elections in April. And this is, in a sense, a referendum on his performance, which has not been good over the past 8 or 9 months. So they're really doing everything they can to get past these elections, get past the Christmas season. And I'm not sure that the outcome will be very different whether they win or lose. I think there's probably simply going to continue to radicalize their economic policies. But again, the electoral cycle is forcing a decision-making process by politicians to deal with those elections. Let me turn now to issues related to security and defense and wrap up with that. And I'll include some foreign policy issues too, just because they touch, I think, in a very broad sense on some of these areas. I think that in a very interesting sense, in the case of Brazil, the whole issue of NSA surveillance and global internet governance and the Brazilian push to raise this on the global international agenda, the push in the UN on privacy issues related to the internet. Again, here's an area where some of the electoral dynamics in Brazil are leading the Rousseff administration to maybe use foreign policy in a way that was used by previous Brazilian administrations, which is to satisfy parts of the base that would like a more to have more of an oppositional stance towards the United States, and also, of course, this affects the administration personally in a sense of who the target of the espionage was. Here's a case where the election cycle, though, may be leading the Brazilian government to make decisions based on with an eye towards what the domestic audience will think about, not necessarily what they would have preferred to do absent electoral conditions. And that clearly has an effect, I think, on security and defense issues in the sense that U.S. and Brazil have been working very hard during the current Obama administration and the Rousseff administration to try to broker a set of approximations and deals and dialogues and coordination efforts on a broad range of really intense range of bilateral discussions that have sort of been interrupted by this. So there's clearly an effect there. I already mentioned Colombia, but clearly with Colombia being such an important partner of the United States in the hemisphere, the electoral outcome, I think, will be critical for us. But even more so, the decisions that are made during the election about the peace process with the FARC also are consequential for us in the sense that they'll shape the kind of Colombia and Colombia-U.S. relationship we'll see in the future, possibly the security relationship, not just depending on who wins, but depending on how the final deal gets spelled out, if it does get spelled out. So that's another area. And finally, I'd also point to, well, not finally, actually, let me add one more issue. Chile, which we have all kind of dismissed as sort of being a non-troublesome election, I actually do think that there'll be some interesting consequences coming out of that election for foreign policy. And here I would point to the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations on trade. Chile being a founding member of that Trans-Pacific Partnership back when it was still the P4, has, under the Piñera government, given it more of a political cast, particularly in relationship to the Pacific Alliance with Peru, Mexico, and Colombia, distinguishing their sort of pro-market, pro-free trade, pro-Pacific economic policies from ALBA and to a certain extent from Mercosur. I think that the Bachelet government coming to power probably means that even though the Chileans will continue to pursue the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Pacific Alliance, they're probably going to want to keep it much more focused on economic issues and sort of lower the political tone that relationship acquired as part of an approximation to Brazil going forward. So that's sort of an aside on that issue. Finally, I would point to Central American elections, Honduras and El Salvador, where public safety issues are paramount and where governments are making decisions with an eye towards elections that are, again, quite consequential. In Honduras, this idea of creating the public order military police is the kind of sort of electorally related decision that in the long run may not be the best decision. It might be wiser to pursue the idea of civilian police reform in Honduras in the long run. That certainly, national civilian police have done a good job in countries such as Colombia in highly conflicted situations. And so there's other models on how to manage that relationship that, might be better than, 4 weeks of training for military police to put them on street policing duties. But that, again, motivated by the fact that you're in an electoral cycle. And in El Salvador, we have an interesting election coming up. If we look back at the sort of the negotiations with the Maras and the sort of the truce that was brokered, we see there another model of how to handle public safety and lower violence, which is to sort of enter into negotiations with armed non-state actors and illicit groups to try to lower conflict. Obviously, the electoral cycle will produce an outcome which will affect the decision whether to keep going down that road with all the consequences it has for rule of law and transparency and public order, or whether to pursue some other avenue. And I think we're still going to continue to see in Central America just a great deal of experimentation on these issues because, of course, current policies have not worked. I mean, the violence just keeps going up, which just drives countries to experiment. And they have to experiment by negotiating. They experiment by, flirting with legalization of certain aspects of it, certain types of illicit trafficking in goods. They experiment with more militarization. I mean, there's just going to be a lot of maybe unfocused experimentation and unplanned and not well thought out experiments as a consequence of this. But who wins those elections will actually probably matter in the long run for what experiment they pick to conduct. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Harold. How interesting, Harold. So, in your summary, you also pass us a pessimistic vision on the effects of this electoral process, and particularly the effects on security and defense. We should be concerned with that, of course. And I was quite impressed with what you said. On Colombia is apparently a healthy electoral process that's coming. The democracy is getting held, but then you alarmed us in thinking that perhaps if Santos turned this peace negotiation into a sort of plebiscite, he will be in trouble. Because if this thing does not work, then it's basically having or not having the public in his favor. What you said about Venezuela was also quite striking and coinciding with what if the resources end at some point. I would say that it would be easy for Mr. Maduro because he just declared the Ministry of Happiness, so he just created, as well as 1984. You remember that book had the Ministry of Truth that had the whole thing. So interesting, the history and the novels, but apparently they repeat themselves. The three of you, I think, brought us quite an interesting plate with several points for us to advance. The issue that keeps looming in my mind is this: if there's this ingredient that you all refer to, the lack of strong institutions, the belief that the elections will resolve the whole thing. It's all about power in the end. When you mentioned the case of Brazil, I just add to that it's impressive to be how the Labour Party, PT, was able to maintain itself in power in front of the major corruption scandal in the history of Brazil. And Dilma, who is a PT leader, is distancing herself from the scandal when all the major associates of Lula are all in jail now, which is the good thing. I mean, good news is that we have those guys in jail. I don't know for how long, but they are in jail at least for a while. And despite of that, the leader, the president Dilma, was able to distance herself from this corruption scandal. Well, we have nothing to do with it. Actually, we are dealing with the problem, which is a fantastic way to really use democracy to create this face that everything is going well. So we go to the question and answer period. Do we have a coffee for a coffee break? So let's do a break, 10 minutes if we can, and then we come back here for the key question and answer. Go out, left, mouse. I'm not very
Yeah, it's hard to do on corporation. It's interesting how U.S. perception. Whereas in the regions, there are many corporation arrangements in place.
Sir, as always, I look forward to greater transparency. Personally, I really hope he gets a job, and if he can't get the job, I hope he stays. Well,
now it allows them to
Still, when you get from MPS, I don't hear much these days.
Well, you know, in communication with Tom. But,
Yeah, things are not going well.
NPS has gone silent. You know, I haven't done anything with them since January, and Deary is such a Deary, the program management is incredible.
Well, I mean, the policy.
Yeah. You were
Everybody I know.
You were very smart. I mean, you got ahead.
I have a couple of friends who.
See.
Sometimes you just
Well, I'm in the position now where I'm searching for Chronicle and other things. I don't want a full-time job, but I would love to get more of what I'm doing now. And I want to try back out to American Military University because at least then I can do it at home.
Now I'm going to use this one.
And unfortunately, when the time is not
I'm
working,
actually now inside Alan.
yes,
Yes, I bring it in. He wanted me to say hi to you. He knew I was coming to this today. And he said,
thank you. Well, I'll see you.
"What are you going to read?" And doing very well. Very well.
into which you throw money.
Everybody's a whole year when you throw even more money at it.
Yeah.
For the Jacob.
Exactly.
So we'll be together then.
Yeah, he'll see you then.
This will be great. Good to see you. I'd like you very much.
Thank you very much.
He is the quintessential political science.
That's true.
Security. Thanks for letting me know. Thank you.
Well, that's absolutely true. And I know, and you're right. We got one for sale. I got one for sale, and the other one we got about a year ago. It's got a little meter on it that tells how your consumes. It turns out, given the price of fuel these days, is dollars. You know, so we ended up with a principally down to Charleston, South Carolina, and the number was 1117.
I see that my audience is more obedient than my panelists. It's good.
You guys are here.
You should have asked us 5 years ago.
I share with you. Okay, friends, here, there, and everywhere. We are open for your questions, and I see already Boris Saavedra frenetically with his hands and Luis Kuhn. Boris, you have the first question. Yes, sir. If you could please just say your name, and if you have a question direct to any of the panelists or to all of them, please be free.
Okay. Boris Saavedra, faculty member here in CHCS. My question is for anyone in the panel. You have talked about division of power. You have talked about transition to democracy. Don't you think that before transition to democracy, to understand division of power, we need to have transition to the rule of law? That's the question.
Okay, well, thank you, Boris. That's an important question to raise, because I think all of us in different ways have said that elections are not mechanisms to solve institutional deficiencies. And so I understand your question to mean that how institutions in a democracy serve to moderate power, and that if the institutions are weak, whether it's the judiciary or the legislature or the executive, and they don't work together, no electoral process is going to resolve that issue. I think there are also problems that are not resolved by elections because of the nature of elections, which I'm sure my colleague Roberto can answer better than I am, where there are systems like in Haiti, which are winner-take-all systems, so that the idea of losing an election and losing it peacefully is still something that is very hard to take in a place where you have that kind of electoral system. I remember years ago inside the U.S. government coming up and talking about how do we train not the winners how to govern, but the losers how to lose. And I think one of the basic features of a democratic system where there's a rule of law that is observed is that when you lose, whether you lose in the court or whether you lose in the Congress, or whether you use, we don't take guns and go up to the step of the Congress and shoot someone, although maybe today we do. But the point is, you didn't hear that, that's off the record. But the point is that we resolve disputes peacefully. So I guess the answer is stronger institutions are the long-term solution. The short-term solution, however, comes with things that my colleagues have described, and that is the training and the understanding of within civil society of how these processes work. When these processes work, then you don't have the violence. But it's, elections, they're about power, but often people don't want to share.
Please, Harold.
I just wanted to add that I think that one thing that is different, I think, about the processes now is I think when we looked at the original set of elections in the 1980s, mainly in the 1980s in the region, there was a certain amount of effort for people across the political spectrum to talk to each other to get to democracy. And they understood that institutions and some sort of basic consensus, some basic understanding of the rules of the game and defending those rules of the game were important to avoid what had come before. And this, you look back at even older institutional processes in Costa Rica or Venezuela in 1958, where people actually thought about what we needed to do in common, even though we disagree politically, we're different political parties, about what the basic common institutional setting should be going forward to avoid going back to what we had before. And I think the issue now is we've lost that sense that that discussion can be had across the political spectrum, even in certain countries in Latin America, which tends to emphasize to add importance to the winner-take-all mentality and the fear of losing power. So in a sense, that debate about why the rule of law was important so we don't go back has been lost because the fear of going back has been lost. Now it's just about we got to hold on to power because we're afraid of what might come in the future if we're not the winners. So there's a counterpart to what Joanna said.
The only thing I would like to add is when you have a president of a government that his or her objective is to concentrate all power, they need to have influence or have control about the judiciary system. And in that regard, we have seen very bad results in many of those countries. And it's very sad. So yes, we want better institutions. Institutions are built over the time. It takes time. It is a process. The question is if we are going in the right direction or not. There are countries that I think they are going in the right direction. There are other countries that definitely not in a great deal, because the political objective is to concentrate and to have all powers under control, including the judiciary system. So when that's the case, there is basically is the rule of the leader.
Dr. Luis Kuhn.
I'm a faculty here. I'm by trade a biomedical engineer. So I'm not a politician, but I try to connect things always. So my question is to Roberto. You spoke about stability by the numbers. The question could be raised then, what is going to happen to the U.S.? Because we are in a financial crisis. We have a dysfunctional Congress. We had the banking problems that we did, and nobody went to jail. And we have companies making $35, $40 billion in revenue, not on sales, on revenue, and yet we subsidize them. So there's a lot of issues, and I would suspect that if you ask every citizen one by one, they probably would say no to many of the things that we're doing. So are we a democracy? And so it brings back the question, what is a true democracy?
I do admire the process that the United States has gone through the last years. Because from the economic point of view, and again, I'm not an expert, the United States has recuperated in a great deal from this economic crisis in a very short time if we compare for the problems that Europe is going and other countries. But going to your question, politically, I am very proud and I'm very optimistic about that in the case of the United States, despite all those problems, the fundamentals of democracy, values, and beliefs have been in a great deal untouched. But at the same time, they were a little happy. We were a little happy because if we recall well, the crisis came the last few months of the campaigns. We are talking between Barack Obama and McCain. If the crisis really hit few months before, I think Hillary Clinton would have won the nomination. Why? Because before that, Barack Obama was, how can I put it, a dream, and something romantic, something, very emotional. I think the United States was making the point that they have to overcome something that happened in the history that the United States was not very proud of, the discrimination. I mean, Europeans most likely and Latin America, we discriminate racially, but we do not do it by law, or not as much by law. But the United States during the 50s, 60s, they were still dealing with that. So I think the United States was sending a very important message to their own people and to the world that we are a nation that stands for what they believe and dream. Again, if the economic crisis would have hit it before, I don't think Barack Obama would have been the nominee. Then I think McCain lost the opportunity because, of course, George Bush was extremely unpopular. But talking about the movie that you were mentioning, if McCain really said, okay, guys, party's over, this is a great guy, he's a great speaker, we are in a very big mess, and for that you need someone with experience, I think he could have had a chance. But again, it happens months before the elections. So it takes time for people to process all that. And remember, usually the crisis is felt months after when we really see the crisis. So the crisis was not on the streets. They were on the numbers. I mean, to the question, okay, we lost billions and trillions of dollars. Where is that money? Well, it's nowhere because it never existed. But then it hit the streets, and that's when it exists. And then it comes the re-election process. In my opinion, the Republicans had an extraordinary opportunity to win that election. The economic situations, at least the worst have passed, and you have the horizon, people vote for the future. And it was a sense that things are going to get better. But what happened in the primary of the Republican Party was so damaging for the Republican Party because it pushed the party so much to the right that at that point it made it impossible for them to win their elections. What I say in CNN, in the midterm elections after the first 2 years of Obama, when we finished the coverage of the election, I said, the journal, after 6 hours being in Atlanta, they say, in 30 seconds, tell me what is the conclusion of these midterm elections when the Republicans won the House. They say, the best news for the Republican Party tonight was Sarah Palin. The worst news for the Republican Party 2 years from now is going to be Sarah Palin. Because in midterm elections, the base is important. In general election, it's the undecided. So sorry I extend a little bit because this is like a kid, I know about that one. Like, that one I know. So, to summarize, yes, I think that Americans should be proud of what happened these last years. The moment they elect Barack Obama, the moment that you have economic crisis, and you were able to relate, whether you like it or not, to the president. So the economic crisis did not really affect the fundamentals and the pillars of everything that we are building. We have consequences like the shutdown and extremists there and there. I don't care about that. That's part of the game. So, yes. But if the crisis would have come earlier, we would be a totally different situation now. And also, if Barack Obama, in my opinion, was reelected, was in a great deal because the Republicans hurt themselves so much during the primary. They pushed themselves so much to the right, and they were portrayed to being totally untouched. In a situation, in economic crisis, when you have to show people, I care. I feel like you feel. And if you're interested in that, if you see the speech of Michelle Obama, that was beautiful. And it was, by the way, the speech more seen on the internet, more than Bill Clinton. Because what she said elegantly, so beautifully, is like, we are in the White House, but we are still like you are. We feel what you feel. That's powerful. And something else. During the convention, Democrats were saying all the time, middle class, middle class, middle class, middle class. The message was there. And I remember then in CNN, say, when Republican convention was coming, say, if I don't hear as many times middle class the next week, they are not going to win. Because that's what they need to do. They need to tell the people, I feel what you feel, what Michelle Obama was saying. I feel your pain. I'm with you. I understand you. And that's, my opinion, explain a great deal of what happened in relation to what you just asked.
Any additions from the panel? Ambassador Matamoros.
Thank you, both Matamoros. I've been listening with very much fascination to your comments. I come from Nicaragua. Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yeah. My apologies. I am from Nicaragua. Thank you very much. I've been fascinated by your comments, and it brought to my mind what a professor used to say, that why democracy was achieved in Central Europe and why did it fail in Latin America. And he mentioned something very important, I think, which is the human factor. And you mentioned, and I think we have a big problem between how you perceive democracy in the United States and how do we react in Latin America. And I think we have a big cultural problem. In Latin America, we are influenced by the French tradition. In the United States, you are influenced by the English tradition. And I don't think we can talk about democracy in Latin America. I think we can talk different types of democracy. You have one which is the ALBA democracy, where you see that the president controls the executive branch, controls the judiciary, the legislative, and the electoral council. You have countries like Uruguay and others where you have this so-called traditional democracy, and we could talk about percentages of democracy. This has resulted in something that I think is very important for us in Latin America, the collapse of the inter-American system. Because at this moment, at this stage, we cannot talk about an OAS. There are different types of OAS, and as a whole, we think that the OAS has role its meaningfulness, and we think that we need a re-engineering of the inter-American system. The other thing that for us is very important is the fact you mentioned Honduras and the question about democracy. In Honduras, in Central America, we believe that Hernandez won, and if you add up the National Party plus the Liberal Party, they represent over 50% of the vote. But more important than that, none of the ALBA countries has expressed an opinion about that result. Ortega in Nicaragua endorsed the victory of Hernandez. So Ortega is a very pragmatic politician, and in my view, we have now a benchmark, I think, which is before the elections of Honduras and after the elections, what will happen with ALBA. I think this is a big opportunity for the United States, which is a great power, which has acted like Haiti in the region, with tremendous shine, it doesn't know what to do. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we have. Are we going in the future to become partners? And what role will play the U.S.? In Latin America, we view the Europeans much more active in terms of democracy standing than the U.S. We see the U.S. more interested in security, the drug policy, than social change. And I think these are the questions that we have to put forward to ourselves and to our American friends. Thank you.
I think, you raise a point that I think I mentioned at the beginning of my talk about the cultural baggage that the United States carries with it from many, many years of policies that were much more interventionist. But I also think that legacy should not color the future. And unfortunately, what I think is a big deficit in democracy building in the region is that other countries which have created strong or continuous cycles of democracies, the Costa Ricas, the Uruguays, the Chiles, the Brazils, which have had repeated cycles, have not been as willing to step up to become part of what I think is a genuine inter-American system to support these. The United States, and I think the Obama policy, if you want to say it's a doctrine, has been from the very outset that we're strong, but we can't do everything alone. And yet the United States is neither an observer at UNASUR nor is Canada. We're not an observer even at CELAC. So there is this exclusionary decision where I think if that's the case, and we respect the decision not to be there, that other countries need to take up that support, because the charter of the OAS, as well as the Inter-American Democratic Charter, both contain principles of respecting democracy. I should also point out that the UN Charter does not contain the word democracy in it. And that's a very important factor to remember. The promotion and protection of democracy only became part of the UN language after the 1991 coup d'etat in Haiti, when the UN, working with the regional organization, the OAS, became a partner in what ultimately became a Chapter 7 intervention to restore a democratically elected government, that is the government of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and that was the first time that is documented the actual use of UN peace operations in support of a democratic government. So I think we've seen an evolution because time, history is not static. It's a dynamic process. And I think if we were looking forward 20 or 30 years, the most optimal situation in this hemisphere would be a genuine partnership of the more mature democratic countries with the United States, with Canada, to begin to do the same kinds of work to support civil society, to support institution building, because these things develop. But if we continue to come back to the vision that, well, because of the past, it colors the future, we'll not make the progress that is needed for people who genuinely have aspirations to live in free and open societies. So that's my feeling, personal
Harold,
feeling.
please.
Just wanted to add a quick comment to what Johanna had said, which I think is I completely agree with you that part of the issue is that the countries who should support the principles of the Inter-American Democratic Charter in organizations outside of the OAS, such as UNASUR, are not really speaking that out loud. I mean, may they say these things, support democracy privately, but they're not saying it publicly. The other thing to keep in mind is that the countries that want the concentration of power in the president, who don't want checks and balances, not only have they gotten better at achieving those outcomes, but they've also gotten much better at preventing traditional democracy assistance mechanisms, whether it's the United States or the international OAS or the international community, or they've gotten much better at blocking those efforts. They're much better at, there's a whole series of sovereignty hardening kind of measures they take to block the operation of international civil society. And it's not just in Latin America. I mean, the Russians are very good at this. There's a whole range of countries that are good at this. But that also means that the tools that once were used in the 1990s or the 1980s, or even the tools created after basically the Portuguese Revolution in the 70s to sort of promote democracy and to help people, train electoral observers, train people on parliamentary procedures and how Congress is operated, and all these things have slowly been blocked out by some governments, which makes it much harder to use the traditional tools of democracy assistance and promotion that we once had.
Now, I do have two questions from our virtual audience. One is from Carlos Murillo from Costa Rica. I will translate that as in Spanish. So I have a question for Dr. Mendelsohn about the elections as an end. I would like that she underscores this fact, because in Latin America, and specifically in Central America, we think better of this as an end, and he believes that this is key. And then he adds another question to that: which considerations should deserve the electoral process in Costa Rica, where the left is in a position in the polls that has never had before in history?
So let me just address the ends and means. I'm sure my colleagues have some thoughts about this as well.
I can get this
I see elections just like democracy as a process. It's a means of incorporating citizen will, political party desires to a given end, which is an open and free society. I also see elections as a process, not yes, it has an end. I mean, you have an election date, you have candidates, you have rules that are followed or hopefully followed in some kind. But the election is really the beginning. It's not the end. Because when someone is elected, you have to deal with losers and the parties that lose. You have to deal with your implementation of platforms. So it's a process that is ongoing. And just because someone wins an election, one only needs to look at the United States to see that when Barack Obama won his second term, it wasn't the end or a ratification of his first term, but rather a means to go forward and a pretty difficult road that he still had to travel. So I mean by that only that these are processes that are very fluid. And the most important thing is, and that's why none of us talked about opinion polls, I'm sure Roberto could talk about that as well, is that, these are snapshots in time, and people's opinions change. They're very volatile. They're affected by, as we talked about, economic crises. They're affected by the weather. They're affected by infrastructure or the lack of it. So what remains stable is the fact that you have rules of the game by which people know for certain that when they follow certain patterns, they'll get a result. And if they don't follow those patterns, the result fail. And I think the biggest challenge is when you have these elections that take place which have observed irregularities or people question the results, you undermine the bigger confidence in the governance process, which is really the challenge. You can have irregularities. As having been an election observer in many countries in Latin America and in Africa, in my own precinct in Maryland, always look and see these bags of ballots under the table. And I'm always ready to go over to the election judge and say, what are you going to do with these ballots? So we're not, immune from these things. But I have confidence in my system that these bags of ballots will indeed be taken to a voting count center, in addition for those people who used a hand ballot rather than an electronic ballot. I've also seen that when you have a high confidence in a system, Brazil, for example, had recent elections of mayors and governors. I happened to be there, and I went with a relative to the voting polls. You vote in 2 seconds. You put your thing in, card in, it goes out, and you get a receipt. And nobody questions that. So I think we all aspire to that kind of level of confidence, which then undergirds other types of participation of the society. Because if you think your process is clean, then you're willing to accept losers and you're willing to accept the results. And I think that's what I mean. If that's too complicated, I'm sorry to be wordy on that. But Harold and Roberto probably have more to say.
Yeah, the other question from Carlos Murillo also is about the electoral process in Costa Rica. He is asking, how do we assess the electoral process there when the left is in a position that is surprising for him, that has never been in history like that? If we do have any comments.
I don't have any clients in Costa Rica, so I cannot answer that.
The only thing I can say about Costa Rica, and I do think it has a very clean and well-established electoral system, and I don't want to comment on, the relative equities of the left versus the right. I know that it's a small country with a lot of rotation of political power. But what is interesting is in a recent security index on public security, which is a major concern throughout Central America, I was shocked to see that even in a country like Costa Rica, which I've always felt was more open, democratic, had 69% of the population polled felt that they did not have a good public security system and felt compromised that way. Now, that's in the most democratic, by Freedom House's standards, country. So I guess to the extent that one polarizes to the right or left is very much a function of your perceptions of your personal safety and your own security. So to that extent, I think we're seeing manifestations of that in Costa Rica. Also, you know this, Roberto, better than anybody else, is that opposition parties always gain when there's an economic downturn. And that's why, it's ironic now because both, I think, in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans, for totally different reasons, have tremendous political problems. And we're also still in a period of recovery, but not enough so that it's hard for someone like yourself who's a political junkie and expert to actually make some kind of prognosis about
what I would like to say, and I will pick up what Harold said in the beginning. When you have strong institutions, really doesn't matter who's going to win as much. Could be from the right, could be from the left. If the institutions are strong and the laws are clear, what you can do for your policies is little, and a great deal what democracy is about. And going back to the United States, of course I was totally against the shutdown of the government, and I really don't like any extremist position in any country, in any situation. But I tell you what, if they are in Congress creating their voice, and even creating a lot of trouble, I take that. Because otherwise, if you do not allow minorities to be represented, you're going to have those people on the streets. So I'd rather have them within the system, working in the system. And the sad part about democracy is that when democracy is designed, that when you are confronted with those situations, democracy prefers the government to be basically shut down. Basically do not be able to operate. Because the contrary is even worse. And in my opinion, that's what happened in Egypt. If you do not allow the voices of the minority to be represented and you impose your voice alone, you are going to have people on the streets. And then 5% of the people can overthrow a government. 5% of the people. And going back to Costa Rica, again, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Chile, also in a good deal, not as much, Colombia, Mexico. I mean, the rules are not going to be changed so easily. So if the PRD wins, the leftists, the conservatives, I mean, what is the space of maneuver that they will have to implement their agenda is going to be limited. Because democracy is about that, limited government, and also, unfortunately, limited action too.
I do have one more virtual question, and then we go to Patricia, and this should be the last one, unless you raise your hand. It's the last time. Either you raise your hand, or will be you have a question. Okay, so you have a question. So the question from Guatemala, Alejandre, is asking how should we assess the case of Guatemala when you do have, he's saying that we are repeating elections for a municipal position after 2 years of general elections, as is going to happen in Guatemala in the next few days. Is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? I think basically what Alejandro is interested.
I work in Guatemala. I work for President Colón. I work in that election, and I helped him during the administration. And they are not repeating that many elections. Let me put it in a different way. You're an expert on that. You don't have any electoral system that is perfect. And in every election, you are going to have problems. Even in the United States, you're going to have complaints what's going on in Ohio, who knows, or in Florida. Yeah? So I can take that, and we should take that. What we cannot take is with the sum of those problems will affect the final result. That's the key. You see, I don't know if I'm expressing myself well. So yes, there are imperfections, there are problems. But we have to be very attentive. If you add those problems, the final result would be different. Then we have a problem. Mexico election, Calderón versus Manuel López Obrador. 0.4, the difference? There were a lot of problems. The question is, if you add all those problems, the final result will be different. I believe not. The last election, even more. Guatemala, on the contrary, the problems of Guatemala, in my opinion, are far beyond what's going on in those municipal elections. Is with 80, you have more poverty that anywhere in the region. Marginalization is extremely high. It's basically the only country that I know that the voters act so differently. For example, Álvaro Colón, when he won, he lost 2-1 in the urban areas. 2-1. Of course, the first result came from the city. So you say, we are lost. No, because we're going to win 4-1 in the rural areas. That's a problem. Colón won. I'm happy for that because I work on that election. But it tells you something about the country, that there is certain divisions that are not healthy. And basically it's what you were saying about inequality, access to education, health, inclusions. All those problems are very, very serious in Guatemala, even more serious than the security problem, which are also very serious.
Patricia, let's listen to the two final questions now. Okay. and then I'll give a chance to the panel to react and also to present your wrap-up comments. Patricia.
Yeah, Patricia Escamilla-Ham, professor at the Perry Center. My question is regarding the elections in Honduras. Roberto just mentioned that when there are strong institutions, the electoral outcome is not as relevant. And also, Joanna mentioned that in Honduras, there are now some challenges to the legitimacy of the the official electoral results. So my question is, given the serious crisis of insecurity, citizen insecurity, violence, crime, corruption, and governance, and the fact that the institutions in Honduras are very, very weak, what political impact can we expect from challenges from this force, the Libre, which is, I believe, the second political force nowadays? What could be the implications of that electoral outcome? Thank you.
And lady, please.
Hi, Margarita Marindale from American University. I just have a simple question, and this would be for the entire panel. We have discussed the importance of the rule of law and also the representation of minorities in the viability of democratic processes. And I would like to get the panel's view on the sweeping constitutional reforms that are taking place in Latin America, especially South America. As you know, Ecuador has adopted a new constitution. Bolivia has ratified a new constitution. Venezuela has adopted some constitutional reforms, and I understand that Argentina is also considering some constitutional reforms. So what does the panel think about the effect of these constitutional reforms on the viability of democratic processes in Latin America?
Thank you. So Honduras and constitutional reforms. We start with Harold.
Thank you. Those are very interesting questions to end on. I think the issue that we see in Honduras is not just the issue of the electoral outcome, but it's also an electoral system that is not really designed for the configuration of electoral forces or the kind of the underlying poles in society that attract that political parties are organized around. And a system which is designed for basically two-party rule, in which now there's 3 or 4 major forces, is simply not, is going to produce outcomes which are more open to debate, that are maybe not as satisfying to voters in terms of determining a majority type outcome, which might not be a problem in a society which has a long tradition of governments elected with minority of the vote, just with a plurality, not a majority. But Honduras doesn't have that tradition, and Honduras is also the country, I think, with the second lowest trust in elections in the hemisphere. So this is, of course, a natural combination that you just are going to have a problem with establishing the legitimacy of the outcome and getting everybody to accept it. Just because literally I think only 43% of Hondurans accept that their elections are legitimate at all, regardless of the outcome. That's 43% of the population. That's quite a low number. So I think that's just an issue there, that the system, the underlying system, is going to have to ultimately reach some sort of transition. I'm not sure if the parties that are currently involved in the debate in Honduras are going to be capable of having that discussion. We'll have to see. And then on the second question on constitutional reform, I think the interesting thing about constitutions is in the countries you mentioned are clearly countries where presidentialism, basically electoral presidentialism, the concentration of power of presidents has probably gone the furthest. And one of the insights, I think, that comes out of institutional design is that institutions are a way of capturing an existing moment in power and sort of freezing them in time. So constitutions, of course, are the most frozen of all in certain ways, the hardest to change traditionally. And we just see presidents who have gone a long way towards concentrating power, towards taking power into their own hands or taking control of other branches of government, of knocking away checks and balances, trying to transform this moment in time that they've achieved into constitutional underpinnings that will allow them and their successors to maintain this type of control, especially, I think, now that they see that this moment might start to slip away, with the economy starting to not do quite as well with a commodity boom receding. This is the moment to seize, to achieve that freezing of authority in a certain configuration that benefits the people that are currently in power. So I think that's the underlying logic that's driving some of this.
I would like to address your point because I feel very strongly. I was in Ecuador when they have that election about the new constitution, and they interview me and they say, okay, the professor from George Washington is an intellectual, right? And he reads everything and all that. Say, what are you going to vote? How are you going to vote? I say, I'm going to vote no. They say, why? Which articles you don't like? I say, no, I haven't read the constitution. I say, so you are voting no and you haven't read the constitution? Yes, I have not read it and I will not read it. Why? Because the fact that the constitution has almost 500 articles, it tells me that the government is not understanding what is a constitution. Constitution is what constitutes a country. And it has to express the basic set of values that we share. And that's a difficult thing to do. If I come to you and say, tell me, not everything, but tell me the 3 most important things in your life, is difficult. And if you are not clear about that, very likely your life will be disoriented. You're going to do this, that. And if you have 500 things that constitute you, it means that you don't know what constitutes you. Simple as that. I mean, you go to the U.S. Constitution. It expresses the relation between citizens and the government, citizens themselves, freedom of expression, and other basic things. And those are the basic rules, the basic principles that we are going to build the whole system. And so, as Harold was saying, basically, all those changes were just a tool to achieve the concentration of power in a certain moment with a certain leaders. And that was feasible because those countries were living either in transition, but more importantly, they were doing economically very well, and people were allowing their leaders to do whatever they want as long as I am having a good economic moment, me and my families. So that's the core of great deal what happened in many countries in the region the last years.
Any final thoughts, Joanna?
Just one comment on the constitutions, and I absolutely share what Roberto said about these roadmaps that are, thousands of articles. But one of the constitutional changes which have been pushed through in many countries, and I don't think any of us really got to it, is the extension of terms that had been set constitutionally, which are now being changed through force or fiat in different legislatures. Argentina is one of the cases which didn't succeed, but still may happen, which is a challenge to the democratic process if you're amending your constitution for this continuation of service, which seems to be the favorite flavor of the month in many countries. And I really think that's where technical assistance and where the democratic charter and some of these other not only regional but international governments from Europe should be coming in and demonstrating that this kind of extension of power is not necessarily healthy to competition or dialogue. So that's my comment on the Constitution. I can't add. On the Honduras situation, I'm not as grim about the situation. I think it's unfortunate now that there is this contest and that there is a division in the election observers. It sounded like a pretty messy process. That said, the Libre Party represents, if I understand it correctly, one of the first new political movements that has come after the liberals and conservatives, which have alternated in power. The extent that they can keep this together and nonviolent is an important option, and a third option for people who are tired of the more traditional parties. And we shouldn't look at it with suspicion unless it becomes a vehicle for repression or violence, because it is an alternate option of choice that has been embraced by many people who felt that their views were not represented by the traditional parties. And I go back to the political science definition of political parties. It is to aggregate interests. And if these interests are not joined together, then you choose something else. And so I think that it may have a positive outcome, but in the short run, it's pretty sausage-making-like right now. So.
Well, thank you so much to the panel. Look, Roberto, I could not resist when you were responding to this constitutionalist thing. Came to my mind immediately that for me it's not that difficult to find the two issues at least. The most important thing of my life, the best thing of my life, my wife. The most difficult thing of my life, my wife. So that was easy. That was easy. So thank you so much for this excellent panel. I think you brought many things for our considerations. For our audience outside, thank you for your attention. Keep an eye on our website. We will have many new things coming all the time. We'll be always glad to entertain you and to have your attention. To the audience, thank you so much for your attention. And if you allow me, and if you could also extend the thankful notes to Mike Mann, that has been effortlessly doing this thing together. And our team here, Abbott and Mike Borders and Abbott and Tricia, thanks so much for your help in this, in putting this together. And please keep also an eye in everything that we are doing here. We are always welcome here. In the Hemispheric Forum, we try to do in a sort of monthly basis as much as we can. And if we don't do that with more frequency, Michael Mann is the responsible for that. So thank you so much, and have a great time. Thank you.